This lesson is titled Lab Setup. You're watching VMware vSphere Power CLI training. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to create a virtual training environment. You'll be able to use this training environment to work through many of the exercises and demonstrations that I'll be showing you in later lessons. We're going to start out first with some ground rules. Then I'll go into some of the hardware requirements. Then we'll talk about the software requirements for building this virtual training environment. And then we're going to talk about different techniques that you can use to virtualize your lab, and I'll go into what I mean by that. Then I'll show you some logical and physical diagrams and work through what they look like in the vSphere client. Okay, so the ground rules. Number one, don't be afraid to use your existing lab or QA environment. If you have something to take advantage of, obviously you're going to want to minimize the amount of work that you have to go through in order to start learning. Okay, so if you've got access to a QA environment at work, have at it. I'm going to show you what will change things, what is safe to do. I actually encourage you to do this in your production environment with some obvious caveats. Okay, exercises that will make modifications will be either self-evident or clearly specified. So, for example, there's going to be some exercises where you will learn how to create a new virtual machine. Well, that is a change to your environment. That's either a change that you understand and accept and can deal with and work around, or not. You know, you might have a lab environment where you'll be able to make virtual machines. But there's lots of things that you'll be doing that don't make changes to the environment, and I'll explain what's what. Now, you don't need much to simulate an enterprise class environment. Maybe you don't have the tip-top, Enterprise Plus license, and with all the features that go with that. Maybe you don't have a SAN. Maybe you just have a couple of small servers. It really doesn't take much. If you want to be prepared for working in an enterprise and you don't have the money to spend to build out an environment on which to learn, that's okay. I'll show you some shortcuts and how you can get there. The hardware requirements, this is virtualization that we're talking about. Hardware is just in the background. There's a lot of things that you can do to work around hardware requirements and to really do some cool things within a lab environment. Number 6, building a lab is one of the best methods of self-teaching that you can possibly do. It's all about doing for yourself, learning for yourself, and going through video lessons like this will really help you out. So I definitely encourage you to stop, pause the video, and try out some of the exercises as you go. And number 7, a virtual lab can be small on the outside but bigger on the inside. There are several vSphere features which require 2 ESX servers. For example, if you're going to want to test how to move a virtual machine using vMotion from one host to another, well, you've got to have 2 hosts with which to do that. You do have to have a minimum of 2 gigabytes RAM in order to set up vCenter. You're really going to have a problem at 2 gigabytes in certain cases. There are some things that you can do. For example, you can fill up your environment with VMs that don't do anything, but when you try to power them on, you might encounter problems. So 2 is the absolute minimum. Storage. Now, shared storage is a requirement for vMotion. There's a few ways that you can get that requirement. You can satisfy it with iSCSI, a fiber channel storage array network, NFS. Now I've got a picture here of an EMC device. You don't have to go there, okay? You don't have to take you don't have to have access to that level of SAN in order to get vMotion. There's some cheap ways to do iSCSI, for example. Network. You need a switched environment with plenty of IP addresses. This is really not something that I have to go into too much. The network requirements aren't steep. For example, in my home lab, I've got a $20 switch. It's not a big deal. Software requirements. You do need VMware vSphere version 4. We're going to be talking about features that are new to version 4 and to some extent version 4.1. You can use either ESX or ESXi. There are some differences that we'll encounter throughout some of the lessons, and I'll explain those where I see them. But for the most part, as long as you have a license and that is kind of an important key, whether it's an eval license or a permanent license. You have to have a licensed product. You can't use an unlicensed eval product. We are going to need vCenter Server. There's a lot of features that we'll be talking about, how to automate them using Power CLI that require vCenter. For example, deploying a virtual machine from a template. Templates are only supported with vCenter. Same thing for vMotion. You're going to need a Windows server on which to install vCenter, and this can definitely be virtualized. I encourage you to do that in a lab environment, definitely. You're going to need a Windows-based workstation. Power CLI runs inside of Windows PowerShell, and you're going to have a Windows box that you can run that from. Now, it doesn't have to be a separate Windows machine. If you want, you could log into your vCenter server and run all the exercises from there. I don't recommend that in production, but you can certainly do that for demonstration purposes. We're going to be using PowerShell version 2. It's been out for some time as I'm recording these videos, so this shouldn't be a problem in most environments. And of course, it ships with Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2, and it's available for as a download for the down level OSs all the way down to Windows XP. Going to need Power CLI version 4.1 or later. This is available on VMware's website. Now we're going to talk about some techniques that you can use to virtualize your lab. Did you know that if you don't have the dedicated hardware, you can actually run ESX Server inside of VMware Workstation? That's right, you're going to run it as a virtual machine. Now, of course, performance is nothing. You don't use this and expect anything out of it. But it's enough to get it up and going, and you can actually play around with a lot of things. Now, a more realistic environment, something that I found that works really well, if you've got a single dedicated machine that you could use as a lab, you can actually virtualize ESX or ESXi on top of an ESX server. So, as opposed to running everything inside of VMware Workstation, where you've got to think about your parent operating system, it has overhead, you're going to have extra memory. If you have a dedicated machine, then yes, you're going to have to worry about an additional piece of hardware, but it's dedicated, and you'll be able to allocate more memory to the operation of running the virtualized ESX servers. Now, you can actually even virtualize your storage. There's a couple of techniques that I've played around with a little bit that I would recommend. The first one is OpenFiler. That's a screenshot here on the left of the OpenFiler interface. This is an open source project, and it is basically a network attached storage appliance, and you can run this. You can even download a pre-configured virtual appliance from openfiler.com. It's pretty easy to get set up initially, at least to get the appliance up. Now, to have shared storage, you're going to have to use something like iSCSI, and you can present iSCSI targets using OpenFiler. That is actually quite a bit of setup and outside of the scope of this particular lesson, but that is definitely one way to go. Another way, and this is something that would be incredibly useful if you've got EMC at work, or if that's something that you want to learn more about in your own studies, there is a virtual appliance that you can use, EMC Solera VSA, and this is something that basically you get to run a virtual EMC storage array and work with the actual features that the Big Daddy has, all virtual. And you can see on nigapedia.com/category/Solera VSA, that's kind of a portal page where you'll find out a lot of information on how to set one of those up. Now let's talk about the logical diagram of my own lab here at the Rotenberg household. This is what my lab looks like, okay? Okay, that's actually not a diagram of my lab, as you might have guessed. This is an overhead picture of Spaghetti Junction in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's very much it's very similar to what my lab looks like. Actually, here's a more accurate diagram, and I only created this. I created this diagram for this slide, And it's really kind of silly with all the different lines going everywhere. And I've got a better way to show it to you, but it's accurate. So on the left here, we have an ESXi. I'm calling this the parent hypervisor, and everything runs on top of this. Inside of ESXi, in virtual machines, I've got two ESXi VMs. That's A and B here. I have a vCenter VM. I have an OpenFiler VM. OpenFiler is presenting an iSCSI target, which is presented to the two ESX VMs. And everything is on the same VM network as well as vMotion network. And I've got a VM kernel iSCSI network that the data traffic travels on. And everything is connected to everything else for the most part. Now these two VMs here, the ESX, are a part of a cluster that's inside of this vCenter VM. Here's the Virtual Center data center right here. I'm calling it VLab, and that's the cluster there. So that's pretty much the layout. Now let's check out the physical space here. I'm running all this on one HP Pavilion P6320F, as in Frank. It's a pretty nice little unit, little tower piece there. Hide it under my desk pretty easily. I've got it configured with 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's got an AMD Phenom 2 X4 820 quad core at 2.8 gigahertz. And I actually have got plenty of CPU speed for my purposes, running all those virtual machines that I showed you a minute ago. And the RAM is definitely the point at which you get stuck. Let me go, and I'm going to show you something here. Let's go to my virtual center. Okay, I've got two vCenter clients open right now. This is my parent hypervisor here on .10. And you can see my virtual machines. I've got Lab ESXi 1 and 2. And you can see this is configured with one vCPU and a little over 2.5 gigs of RAM. I found that at 2 gigs of RAM even, it was pretty hard to power on virtual machines, so I did need to bump that up a little bit. The second one is configured the same way. This OpenFiler virtual machine, this is, as I mentioned before, a pre-configured virtual appliance that you can download straight off of openfiler.com. It's configured with 512 megs of RAM. I haven't touched the defaults for that. And then I've got a vCenter VM. This is running Windows 2008 Server R2, 64-bit, 1 vCPU, and 2 gigs of RAM. And I've been playing around with vCenter Mobile Access. I'm not going to be talking about that during this lesson, but I had room for another VM, so that was kind of interesting. Let's look at the overall resource level. You can see here that I'm not using a whole lot of CPU at all. Memory is definitely the limiting factor, but I've actually got a little bit of growth. Got 2 SATA disks, physical SATA disks in my HP tower server, and that's provided plenty of space for my needs. Here are the networks that I mentioned to you. I've also got one created here for working with VMware fault tolerance. And overall, this has worked out pretty well. Let's take a look at the vCenter instance. Now you can tell we're in vCenter. We've got more guts, more stuff to play with. Here's my hosts and clusters view with my 2 virtualized ESXi servers here at the top. And they are running 4.0. I didn't mention it, didn't show you, but the parent hypervisor is running 4.11. And I've got a handful of sample virtual machines in various states of disrepair. That's on purpose. I gotta show you how to fix them as I go. Got a template, so on and so forth. So that's pretty much that environment. Let's finish up this slide here. When I bought the HP server, I did find that not everything was on VMware's supported hardware list. Of course, this is a workstation class system, so it's not officially on anything. But the network card that came with the system didn't work out the box. I found the easiest way was to just buy some cheap parts After doing some research, I found what would be a good chipset to buy. So I definitely went with this Intel Gigabit Ethernet network interface card. Works out great. Same thing for the onboard SATA controller. That one wasn't working out, and I actually am booting up off of a USB key to boot up to ESXi, and it couldn't see the hard drives. So I had to buy an PCI controller. This is Promise SATA 300 TX4, and I've had great luck with that. It works great. I can see all my drives, and it's got 4 ports on it. As I mentioned before, I've got 2 1 terabyte SATA disks. That's been plenty of space. Total cost around $900. Really pretty reasonable for what I was trying to do. I think it works really well. Like I said, it's got plenty of CPU. The limiting factor is the memory. So 8 gigs is probably the smallest that you'll be able to get away with if you want to run 2 ESX servers, vCenter, plus a virtual storage appliance of some kind. So what we've covered in this first lab setup lesson, we talked about the ground rules. This is kind of laying out how I'm going to be showing you things. We talked about the hardware requirements, software requirements, a couple of techniques for virtualizing your lab, and of course we went through my logical and physical diagrams.